Why should we believe in heaven? I don't think I've ever actually heard a discussion of that. Not in so many words. Usually, people who have faith accept heaven in very vague terms. They point to certain scriptural passages. People who do not have faith um, laugh about the suggestion. In fact, I wrote down some questions that I've heard asked about heaven, and many of these are tongue in cheek. Do we go there in body or spirit? If in body, how old are we? Are we 20? Are we children? Are we 85? Do we look like we did on the day that we died? Do we look the way we did in our healthiest moment in the prime of our life? If we were blind, can we see? If we had a limp, can we walk straight? Well, what if we go in spirit? That seems to remove all those other problems, but so how do we experience bliss? Heaven is supposed to be a blissful place, but if you don't have any senses, how do you perceive anything that's pleasant? Do we go there as a reward for good deeds? Or do we go for having the right faith regardless of what deeds we did? Well, if we go there for good deeds, then, what if you died when you were a 6-year-old child and you didn't really live long enough to do anything particularly good or bad for that matter, but you just don't have anything on the good side of the ledger? That doesn't seem fair. Well, it seems even less fair if you go there for whatever right faith is. That's kind of arbitrary. If you were born at a certain time in a certain part of the world where it just happens that you won the lottery. A lot of people claim that they believe in a God. Who knows who the right one is? But if you're the lucky one who believes in the right one, then you get to come in. That seems ridiculously arbitrary. Well, if you go there for faith and you have the right faith, whatever that is, and you've done the rituals and you've gone to the right church and you've sung the right hymns and you've checked all of those boxes, but you're terrible in your actions, you're a scoundrel, so you get in spite of that? That seems awful. Good thing there isn't a heaven. I mean, most of these questions would be asked, I think, by people who are just laughing up their sleeve. And especially these last couple, what do you do when you get there? Because, I mean, heaven is supposed to be the end of time. Are you just sitting around singing hymns to God? And how can you even do that if time is over? It seems like on the first note you'd get, oh, and you get stuck because there's no subsequent time. You can't sing the song because time has come to an end. Doesn't seem like God would enjoy that very much either. But okay, so you get to enjoy joyful pastimes. If you like tennis, you get to play tennis. You like video games, you get to play video games. Wouldn't that get old, though, if it lasts forever? Seems like anything would get old if it goes on for eternity. Well, pardon me for acting facetious and kind of silly as I go through this, but as I say, this is exactly how people act, usually, when they ask questions like this. And we seldom mount much of an answer, which is what I would like to do in this next series. I'm going to be talking about what I think heaven must probably be like, insofar as it's possible to kind of piece it together from moral inference. And to me, the emphasis is on moral, because of all the attributes of God, I think that being the supreme moral being is even more important than being the supreme physical being. God can create the entire cosmos that we see, but if he isn't supremely good, then he's not the being that we worship, not the one that I worship. Of course, I believe that he's both, but let me wind up this initial video just by making a statement and then a couple of observations. This is where I take my stand to begin with. I consider it, and I've said this in previous videos, a moral fact that without a metaphysical origin of goodness, there can be no possibility of motivation for our deeds except culture or biology. Everything that we could possibly do would be done because we were brought up that way and we were brainwashed. And maybe there's a rational basis to the brainwashing. There usually is to culture. You know, people are supposed to not steal because if everybody stole from everyone else, then societies, communities would disrupt into civil war. It would be a Hobbesian jungle. Nobody would survive. But there would be no, no feeling of, oh, I shouldn't do that because it's wrong. It would just be because you were brought up that way. And of course, the other basis for actions would be our biology. We would be motivated by our various kinds of hunger for food, hunger for praise, for sex. Fear is a very biological drive. So is anger, for that matter. The passions, as the ancients used to call them. That would be that and cultural conditioning would be the only possible basis of our behavior. That means that you would never find a case of, say, a man walking down the sidewalk, he sees a burning house, a woman is hysterical on the lawn and screaming, oh, my baby's inside. And the man rushes into the house, gets burned all over, but he comes back out with a baby, the baby of a stranger. He has no idea who this woman is. There are people who occasionally do things like that. Most of us kind of wish we would, but we probably don't really have the courage at the right moment. But you know what? Practically all of us admire the person who does that. Where would that come from? Not only the fortitude to do the deed, but also from the rest of us, the admiration of the deed. If there were no moral inspiration from beyond this world, wouldn't we just shake our heads and say, you idiot, that's not your baby. That woman doesn't have any money. There's nothing in it for you except maybe getting burned alive. Why in the heck did you just do that? We can't explain why somebody occasionally will die for another person. Say a policeman. Didn't know him personally, but I knew of a policeman in Ireland many years ago he and his fellow officer, and they didn't arm their cops in Ireland. They were both being taken to a quarry to be executed by an IRA terrorist. And the older cop, who was married and had 6 kids, threw himself on the machine gun of the thug so that the younger one could get away, which he did. He saved that man's life. Why? He had 6 kids of his own. Maybe he should have thrown the younger officer on the machine gun and made a run for it himself. Why do people ever do things like that? Unless there's a higher force that lifts us up to something better than we are. Now, I've covered this ground before when I was talking about affective reasons to believe. This is the moral reason. We human beings have tried to supply our own reasons to make heaven on earth. We've tried, especially in the previous century, the late not so great 20th century, to do away with morality and the spirit and just use human logic to build the perfect society. What would that be like? Well, it would be a place where there's no sickness, there's no poverty, people have all they need to eat, they have clothing, there's no crime. How are we going to do that? Well, how were the attempts made to do it? We had brutally dominant autocrats and their goons that executed people by the million. The Black Book of Communism claimed that upwards of 100 million people were killed by communism in the 20th century. Communism is a utopian undertaking that's trying to make heaven on earth. And it tries, in fact, to be sure that everybody has everything that he needs. And the way that you get people to do this is you make them so terrified that they're afraid to step out of line. Because, human beings are going to make mistakes. Well, we can't have mistakes. We can't have people being bad because it's going to corrupt the utopia for everyone. So everybody has to behave. You're being watched. And if you misbehave, we'll make an example of you. These were hell on earth. Every time we human beings try to be logical and create heaven on earth, we make hell on earth. This was the insectification of human beings. We took out the spirit. We took out that feeling of inspiration from above. That is all fake. And instead we used logical objectives, and we constructed ways to those objectives that obviously applied force where needed. And boy, was there a lot of force, and we didn't get to heaven on earth, didn't quite make it there. Those 100 million people ended up somewhere, but it wasn't in an earthly utopia. I hope their souls are resting in peace. Here's my conclusion for now, for this first segment. It seems to me that if goodness is this inspiration that comes, we know not whence, but it's in us, if we have that devotion to goodness, then that's the best thing about us. It may be like 5% of us, and there's another 95% of us that's not cooperating. And that's the part that limps around and lies and is egotistical and all the rest of it. But if there's one part of us that we wanted to survive and live forever, surely it would be that part that is kind of, in a way, not really us, but it partakes of the higher us that exists in God, in God's will. And that is the part that we would be. If we could survive only in that one part, then that in itself would be a kind of immortality. If you could survive in the goodness that you worship, that goodness doesn't have a beginning and an end. It doesn't die. It's forever. That in itself should be, I don't think it's the only thing we can say about heaven, but that should be a good beginning point for heaven. I'm going to close by reading you the opening lines of a book that is out of print now, but I published this many years ago. I'm talking about the Roman orator Cicero, and he's talking about the passionate conviction of dedicating one's life to goodness. And he addresses this comment to the personification of philosophy. She's a woman in Greek and Latin, philosophia, so he refers to her as a female. For a single day lived well by your precepts, philosophy, must be rated above a corrupt immortality. And when he says immortality, of course, he's talking about the classical gods and goddesses who lie around on their pulvinars, their couches at the feasts. Someone's peeling them a grape. Someone over here has some nectar or some wine. An eternity of that, Cicero says, is not worth a day of living in the good. And remember, this was a pre-Christian, a pagan philosopher. If a man from pagan antiquity recognizes the eternity of goodness, which we in some small way can partake of, because in some way that's where our ultimate identity is, if he recognizes that, then surely we can recognize that too. And that's a good place to start off talking about heaven.